Hi, folks. Today, I'd like to delve into and discuss what are protocols, especially in terms of software, and often as they are defined in computer networking and telecommunications standardization efforts. So, what really is a protocol? So, let's say protocol. What is it? So, a protocol is a standard. It is a standardized way of doing something so that things can interoperate, right? So that things are not ad hoc. Because if you have to um, have interoperation amongst components from different vendors, from different organizations, you need to have a common understanding. If not, then there cannot be any interoperation. And interoperation is necessary because the domain and the services that are required of a telecom network or of software applications is fairly complex, and multiple teams, multiple companies often have to collaborate and complement with each other in order to do bigger things, right? So you can only do so much alone, whether you are an individual person or an individual company. For a larger effort, you need to have standardization so that when each team, each company um, goes back to their own place and works on an implementation of something, of the same thing or some part of the same thing, then they do agree upon where do these parts fit together in the large scheme of things when they have to be integrated or interoperated. So that is the reason that protocols exist. Hence, they are standardized. So with that in mind, let's evaluate protocols further. So protocols are standardized, specified in detail, and they in turn are defined by two things: by their interface and by their behavior. And both of these aspects are also specified in detail, unambiguously, and crisply, right? So let's explore them further. So, what is an interface? So, an interface is the external layer, the external dimension of the protocol definition, right? Let me explain that a bit more. Let me just change the color and explain that a bit more. So let's say, in some ways, let's say we could explore some examples of interfaces. So an interface, let's say one example could be the function name. These examples are not necessarily from protocols per se, but they help put forth the point and to make you understand what is it that we mean by an interface here. So let's say there is any function. So let's say we are defining a function in C style, square root of floating point parameter, and this returns a floating point parameter, which is the square root of the input parameter, right? So this is the function name, square root. So this, in a sense, is an interface. What does it tell us? It tells us that there is a function whose name is square root. It expects an input, which is a floating point integer. And as an output, as a return value, it gives you a floating point integer, which is equal to the square root representation of whatever is given in the input. That's all this interface is telling. So as opposed to this interface, the behavior is dictated by implementation. That function has to be implemented somewhere, right? So we have an implementation of that interface. All right. So an interface can also be thought of as a promise in some ways. So an interface, so this is an interface is a promise that, hey, my name is square root. If you give me an input of floating point type, I'll give you in return a floating point type representation of a square root. It's a promise. So let's say with this promise, a team is given the task of implementing this function. And let's say there are 4 other teams who are told that such a function with this interface will be available, and they can write their own software that uses this function as they want to write it, right? So maybe the 4 teams each have written 10,000 lines of code calling the square root function 400 times each, even though it's not implemented yet. Even though it's not implemented yet. But that's not a problem because the interface, the promise is set in stone. This is the value, right? Okay. So interface as opposed to implementation, interface as opposed to behavior. Both have to be standardized. And this is where this analogy goes only so far. So in this particular example, as long as the implementation gives the square root of whatever input is received by the function, then it is the implementation is correct, as long as there are no other non-functional requirements. And in that sense, the behavior of the implementation can be easily written in one line, give the square root value of input right? So this is the behavior. And we can hide behind this single line because the concept of square root is well understood in mathematics, right? If somebody wants to know what really is a square root, they can go consult a maths book. And there are many methods for finding square roots, but that is quite enough for crisply defining the interface as well as the implementation requirements. All right, so another type of interface could be let's say a web service. So these are all protocols. In some way, this tuple is a protocol. So a web service definition, and as opposed to the definition, the detailed implementation is in its behavior. So similarly, in terms of network protocols or other software protocols, we have the interface part. Let's say typically in terms of a network protocol, we have what goes on the wire, so-called, on the physical medium. And what is it that an active entity, an active node, what is the type of behavior that an active node indulges in when it receives or sends something on the wire? So let's say we could give examples of HTTP, FTP, etc. So as we know, these two protocols are defined by the IETF in their RFCs. And if you read the specifications, you'll see that the interface and the implementation, the behavior, not the implementation, sorry, the behavior are specified very crisply and separately. So let's say if we are to um, discuss an HTTP command, let's say there's a get command, and then you have a URL of a resource. This is the broad term format of a get command. So this is the interface part, and it is specified in the RFC. And against that, the detailed behavior would be specified behavior would be written in detail within that RFC, that if you receive a get command over HTTP, and if an HTTP server receives this command, then what is it supposed to do? Whether this URL is a relative URL or it's an absolute URL, and the detailed behavior would be specified that go in the uh, root directory and look for a file name named this and this, load up in memory, parse it, or don't parse it, just load it up and send it back as a buffer to get response, etc., etc. The detailed behavior is specified. So yeah, this is just one example. Similarly for FTP, similarly for other protocols. So one other way to look at it is that um, an interface, let me just change the color somewhat. So an interface is, let's say, if there are two nodes, this is a web browser which has an embedded HTTP client in it. It has an HTTP client. And, this is a network. And on the other side, we have the web server, that is HTTP server, that is hosting the resource which is required, right? So you write something, whatever, www.abc.com / cat.jpg. And let's say in the local file system of this main public directory of this HTTP server, right? We have, amongst other files, this cat.jpg file. So when you enter this URL into your HTTP client, it makes a GET request and it sends it over to the network. On the other side of the network, you have the HTTP server, which has the resource the client is looking for in its local file system. So the HTTP server knows how to process it processes the command. It says that there is a get command. It has its parameters. The parameter tell it that, okay, there is a resource called cat.jpg, which is required. And, it files it on the file system. It looks for the resource. It loads it up into memory and a buffer, right? Broad term. And it sends it back as a response to this, where is it? This get query back to the client. And, you see a cute picture of the cat on your browser, right? So this is typically how protocols of all sorts are specified in detail, unambiguously, crisply, and across two dimensions. One dimension is that of the interface, the promise, which could manifest as a set of commands. Um, and the other part is the detailed behavior corresponding to each type of interface. For example, corresponding to each type of command or any other interface, like we have the RESTful API, so on and so forth. So I hope this was somewhat useful. And moving forward, we'll discuss many types of protocols, especially those that are used in the telecom networks. Thank you. And if you find this useful, you can write any comment. If you want to um, request a certain topic, you could also write it in comment, and we'd love to entertain that. All right. Have a good day. Um, and I hope this is useful. Bye.